I am with Herbert Scurlock today, and I will be interviewing him for the Southern Labor Archives at Georgia State University. We are at his home in Annapolis, Maryland, and it is Sunday, Saturday, the 17th of December, 2022. Mr. Scurlock, we talked some about the recording and how it's going to be used and used for research at Georgia State University Library. Did you have any questions or follow up about that? Do you?
None of one.
Okay, and you do understand we're recording and that you've agreed to be interviewed and recorded.
Yes.
Okay. Um, Thank you so much for having me in your home to do this interview. I'm excited to get started, and we always start at the same point, which is where and when were you born?
September 25th, 1933, in Washington, D.C.
And had your family been there a long time?
Yes. Um, my grandparents, grandfather, and granduncle uh, migrated from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, up to D.C. One uh, became a medical doctor, physician, surgeon, and one of the person, doctor who utilized x-rays in the curative process. My His brother was a renowned uh, photographer in the Black Society of D.C., Addison Scurlock.
Addison Scurlock?
Yeah,
And that was your uncle, and it was your grandfather that.
yeah, Herbert C. Scurlock.
Okay. What did the C stand for?
Clay.
And you told me, you mentioned that he was at Howard.
He was at Howard. He was in the medical school as a professor, and in his course of being there, uh, uh, originally applied X-ray in terms of diagnosis and the healing process, and he's been credited for that.
Can you tell me more about his day-to-day work? Was he a practicing physician, or was he
Well,
did research more, or?
he was a physician, surgeon, and biochemist,
And
and a professor at Howard University.
do you know where he got his training?
Uh, it's a combination of Southern black colleges and Howard University.
So, do you know what caused them to move to DC? Do you have any background info on that?
No, no.
Okay. But wasn't that about the time? Maybe the Great Migration came a little later than that. So, your family settled in DC,
Yeah.
and is that where your parents met?
Yes.
Can you tell me about them?
Well, my father and mother uh, married right out of high school when they had me. Um, my father worked at the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, and my mother had a clerical job in the government.
And what part of DC did you grow up in?
Northwest.
Can you tell me about your childhood and growing up there and what that was like?
Well, I grew up on Westminster Street, which was between 9th Street, 10th Street, and ST. That was a single block. And I was raised by the community in essence because the elderly residents used to police me in the neighborhood. I'll never forget that time when I had taken the job with FAA and had a revolving shift work, which meant that I worked kind of like 24/7 with a big break in between reporting back to work. And oftentimes I might be seated at the bench in front of my house, and the senior ladies came by and would say, "You bum, why don't you go to work?" That's kind of the neighborhood I grew up in. So they kept me all the time on the straight and narrow.
So, what was your early education like?
Oh, well, my father had two sisters who were educators or teachers, and we used to have Sunday dinner at Dr. Scurlock's house, and we'd all rally around the table. Now, these aunts of mine were, of course, in the society of school teachers, so they knew my school teachers and got a lot of feedback on me.
Oh, yeah?
And so, again, I was kind of kept in educational control, and there were certain demands of performance that they all demanded of me. And I'll never forget that old encyclopedia that they had grown up with that I studied on some of my school assignments on weekends. I believe it was Britannica. A dusty old Britannica, which was still good in terms of what was being taught in that day.
And what kind of work did your parents do?
Okay, my father worked, I gather, in the print shop, and my mother was kind of a clerk typist person in the government.
Okay.
My father remarried when I was in my early teens, and she demanded certain things of me because she was trained as a social worker but had never raised children. I recall a situation where I'm sitting at the table and she served chicken. And after eating the chicken, I asked to be served more. And she said, name the part that you want. I sat there, I don't know the name of those pieces. I just wanted chicken. So she was a taskmaster. And it wasn't all bad. I think the result was good. But she made me jump through the hoops.
Do you think having a stepmother, and maybe your parents splitting up when you were so young, do you think that is part of what pushed you out into the neighborhood for the whole neighborhood to bring you up, or was it like that for all the kids in your neighborhood?
No, it was not. As a teenager, there was not much socialization with the kids in the neighborhood. I think that community was mostly all adults at that time. They were, she had been previously married to the governor of the Virgin Islands, and her travel was not by airplane, it had to be by ship. And so that had gone awry because of her absentee in her activities, getting the kids from the Virgin Islands into college scholarships. So she was working in humanity-related kinds of activities as the governor's wife, but absentee from the islands a lot. It did not prevail. The two of them owned a house in D.C., which they jointly shared, and on the divorce, they both she had to pay him off in terms of his share of the house, which invoked a hardship on her and my father when they married. I remember my father making my bed himself in his tool shop, cutting the wood and assembling the bed that he had made to accommodate me. I remember the family having one used car, which was a Studebaker, which you have to go way back to know what that is. It was a used Studebaker at that they had purchased, no new cars. And after I got my permit, we used to fight over who was going to get the Studebaker when. I think the only time I got it by myself was during prom night.
Well, if you only get it once, I think that's probably the best time to get it.
Yeah.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
No, only child.
Only child. Okay. Do you know how and what was her name? Your stepmom. What was her name?
Alma.
Alma. Do you know how she met your dad?
Uh, Not really. I only know that uh, once the two of them got together, and it may have been previously, uh, that he went back to finish his college and finally get the white collar job in the government in the Office of Civil Rights uh, in I believe in transportation.
And was that before or after he worked for the Bureau of Engravings?
Oh, it was after.
Okay.
He got his qualifications up and became uh, a civil rights investigator.
Did he talk about that work at home? Do you know what he did in that role?
Yeah, normally a part of the process, civil rights process, is kind of a built-in civil rights grievance uh, aspect, and so the purpose of it is to investigate it and provide the particulars of the investigator and what it reveals for management then to step in and try to rectify what the problem is, if it's legitimate. And so that was his job. A person might complain discrimination because of their office, his office, the office of the complainant was the only one without a window, uh, compared to a complainant having been in a job where he trained incoming non-minority people and having them promoted over him as a supervisor. Those are very serious kinds of situations where he had to investigate the details.
That sounds like difficult work.
Yes, yes, it was. He had to travel throughout the jurisdiction, like Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, to interview people.
I imagine at that time that a lot of those places were hostile to African Americans.
Oh, indeed, indeed.
Would he travel with a white coworker to places, or was it just him?
As far as I know, it was just him.
Okay. Did he talk about his work a lot at home?
Well, during that time, the I remember Philip Morris Cigarettes used to publish a black accommodation guide that you knew if you were going to certain cities, you better book your reservations in certain black establishments, so that if it's going to be overnight, that you could be accommodated or assured of accommodations. And so that was used a lot, but I don't think he discussed too much of it with me as a kid.
Um, is there anything else you want to say about your parents, your dad?
Well, not. It doesn't occur to me at this point, except that, I get a different perspective and a better appreciation of what they were trying to do to um, shelter me as best they could. Now, I think my stepmother was very active with the Quaker organization, and that's why how I was able, how I, she was able through her uh, persistence to get me a scholarship to a Quaker college, which was Swarthmore College in Pennsylvania, from which many prep school uh, kids attended.
Okay. Well, before we get to Swarthmore, I want to back up a little. Tell me about prom night. Tell me like about school and your friends there and what your favorite subjects were.
Well, I uh, I was president of the class um, of 1950 in high school. Uh, I was in the Army ROTC, Junior ROTC, uh, and during that period, the black high schools, because schools were segregated at the time, used to have a drilling competition. And so I was one of the uh, so-called soldiers in the ROTC uh, uh, from Dunbar High School, and we had a military coordinator who was assigned to the high school uh, to train us and bring us along. And when our first competition that I was in, I was one of the troops, and our particular uh, organization from Dunbar won the citywide competition of all the black schools. And following that, became a member of the regimental staff, which meant that regimental staff was over all of the schools uh, just prior to my graduation.
What did you study? What classes did you like?
Well, I guess I can't truly say I like one more than the other.
I'm sorry, let me stop you there because our recorder just went off. Low battery. I need to change the batteries. I'm so
Okay.
sorry to interrupt you right there, but we will come back.
Okay.
And I will ask the question again.
Okay.
Let me pause this recording. And we'll pick up. So, the last thing I'd ask you is about what subjects you like, what you like to study in school.
Well, I liked speech or English because I wanted to be a performer on stage, and that truly did not come out, come to being as far as the English teacher was concerned because of my enunciation. And so I was relegated to the stage crew, projecting the lights from a booth onto the stage and the performers. I think that as an alternative, I used to be the announcer for some of the kids' performances that were set up by themselves and not by the teachers. And so that was one of the things I found interesting. A lot of what I did in other classes was pretty much feeding back to the teachers who gave the lectures just about what they had said to me without getting into a rationalization as to what trends are and so forth and so on, which was one of my shortcomings because I was concerned about remembering dates rather than what the trends through those dates was beginning of what ultimately came about.
Did you like to write? Because you said you liked English, and did you enjoy writing?
Oh, yeah, I enjoyed writing, and I would say that a lot of that had to come about when I was in middle school, when I had moved from the lower Northwest to join my father in the upper, and his wife knew my wife, in the upper Northwest. Banneker Junior High, I was placed in a class with the president of Howard University at the time and the treasurer of the Industrial Black Bank's daughter. The being in all of that lofty kind of situations, having come from the southern part of Northwest, when the teacher saw this stranger in the class that she had carried for about 3 years, she wanted to know who I was and where did I come from. And when I mentioned the schools I came from, she grabbed me by the scruff of my neck and took me to the principal's office and said, "How dare you put this thug in my class?" and then of course the principal said, "Don't do that to him. You stuck with him because he's the stepson of the ex-wife of the Virgin Islands governor." So Anyhow, once I was in her class, she had a book that was handwritten by her students along the way that had to do with propositions, had to do with tenses and all kinds of things. And she gave me a month to find somebody to copy their book and make my own book and to be ready for recitation in a month. And so here I am walking down. My room was in the basement of the house. And I'm walking up and down reciting indicative mood, active voice, past tense, and conjugating the verb and all that kind of stuff that was in the book. And so I was challenged to recite without flaw, because I knew if she said to me and sat me down, I was in trouble. So never did get an A from that class, always a B. So those kinds of hardships kids who move about have to encounter.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you moved from the southern part of the northwest part of DC to the north, or the lower part to the upper part, I guess is how you put it.
Yeah.
So who were you staying with before you moved?
Oh, I was staying with my grandparents on mother's side.
And what did they do?
Okay, well, for the latter part of my stay, my grandmother was bedridden. My grandfather used to work in a New York congressman's office that he had come from New York in the early days work for. So he used to have a government job, and my grandmother used to raise me before her invalid status. Used to be very active socially with the grand executive ruler of the Elks, which is a black organization. She was referred to as I'm trying to think it was my mother was I forget the term now. Somewhere there's Duchess, and I'm trying to remember what the term was for my grandmother.
Okay. Well, if you think about it, we can come back to it.
Oh, sure.
Okay. But while we're talking about family, that reminded me, I didn't really ask you about your uncle, the photographer. Can you talk a little bit about him?
Well, I can. He was in D.C. when, he had started out in his home doing photography, and later on he got the contract with the D.C. black public schools to take photography of the classes, and he had obtained a revolving camera they could sweep and rotate from left to right and predict uh, provide a print that incorporated 400 kids all lined left from to right and tall and short, uh, and starting out in his home, he had became known as a preferred black photographer, kind of like Vandersea was in New York.
Right.
And every family had to have their baby picture photographed, and this was after he got his studio. In his studio, had to have a baby picture or a wedding picture by Scurlock. I mean, that was the ultimate. And during the riots after Martin Luther King was assassinated, he took photos of the insurrection that took place in D.C. And he kind of canalized all of that.
That's fascinating. Do you know because it sounds like he was first a society photographer.
Yes.
Which is a very important role in the very least a middle class community, right? Like a thriving middle class. And it sounds like you were really part of communities that were pretty inclusively African American, but still like really healthy economies and really what am I trying to say? Like kind of maybe self-sustaining outside of reliance on white businesses.
Well, what happened was when he and his brother migrated to D.C., he had taken a job in one of these white society photography shops, like Harrison Ewing and those folks. And he used to be in the back room learning and doing the processing of their photographs. And that's how he became so well a performer in the art.
Okay. And do you know, does the family still have his photos, or do you know if they are?
Well, his photos were turned over by his son's widow to Smithsonian, and so his negatives and his mostly negatives were turned over and categorized by Smithsonian. I'm not sure. I believe, yes, that it's in the Black History Museum now.
Okay. Okay, I've been there, so if there are any on display, I might have seen them and just, didn't know at the time. So, okay,
but they had put together one program that I attended that had both him and Vanderzee's photos together. One about New York and one about D.C.
How long ago was that? Do you remember?
Oh my God. I guess probably in the early 50s, I guess.
Okay. So your mother's father worked in government, like in politics,
Yeah,
and you had an uncle who was a society photographer,
yeah,
and a stepmother who was once married to the governor of the Virgin Islands,
yeah,
and your grandfather was a doctor,
yeah,
and your father did really important civil rights work.
yeah.
So, what was expected of Mr. Herbert Scurlock when he graduated? What was it like? What was important for your family to impress upon you for your next step once you graduated high school?
Well, it was expected that I would ultimately become a college professor because they thought that was the greatest respect I could obtain. Uh, and I became kind of a disappointment to my stepmother in that regard. Um, I really wanted to become a doctor, but that didn't work out.
So, what did you do when you left high? Because you said that you liked um, English and you liked writing and you were in ROTC.
Yeah.
Um, where did you go right after high school?
What did I go right after
Yeah,
high?
did you go directly into college? Did you join the military? Did you
Oh, I
work?
went. I went directly into college.
Swarthmore.
The interview was an interesting one
Okay.
because here I am, a lone black guy, sitting in the middle of a circle of white professors, all firing questions at me. And that was when they were interviewing for scholarships. And somehow I passed and made it through that. Um, I My first year I had an extra heavy curriculum, and it was extremely challenging for the kids from city high school and not a prep school. And so my perspective was a bit different from what they were looking for. Um, I did all right in terms of my peers. I think there were only 3 black students in the entire college. Okay? And I was president of the class,
Of the freshman class?
in the freshman class,
Okay.
yeah. And as a class of 54. An interesting way I obtained that socially. Uh, I used to have the duty of working in the mess hall, uh, cleaning tables and uh, dishes and things like that, and I worked my way up to head meat server, and that helped me become president of the class. I mean, I'm not talking about anything academic, you understand? And those were the days.
So more networking.
Yeah.
Okay. Was it a big adjustment moving from DC, where you were in primarily areas like African American neighborhoods, African American schools, to not only away from your family, but to a predominantly white college?
Yes, it was a real terrible adjustment because it was during segregation times. And to get a haircut, I had to go to the white barber shop, and the barber would pull the shades down so nobody could look in. Okay.
And what about the students? What about the classes?
Well, what happened was there were things that were challenging instead of, for example, I flunked chemistry, which was really the backbone of where I was planning to go. And it was on the basis of a lab experiment that I was assigned in qualitative analysis to identify what the compound was in the unknown. And normally I'd studied well to find out if you put this strip into the unknown, it would turn blue, and that would tell you that it was alkaline or whatever. Or you take a different strip. I had all my strips there, and I dumped it into the unknown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And none of them turned color. And so I didn't rationalize that if it was none of the above, there must be water. So I flunked chemistry on the basis of that.
Oh. Well, what about your other classes?
Well, they kind of gave me passing grades, but my parents determined there's something wrong with me, and they sent me to a psychiatrist. Find out what's wrong with my mind, what's holding me back. And I took a job working as a file searcher during the summer at the Immigration and Naturalization Services. And that was the time when computers used IBM cards with holes punched in them. And I normally folks who were immigrants and had applied to come into the country would have a file that was to be utilized to process them. Some of the files would show up missing, and boy, if you found one file, you done your week's work. Usually they were behind the file cabinet or under it or whatever. And so my salary went to psychiatrist. And he was supposed to help me find out what was wrong. And so after finding out all the pressures that my stepmother had placed on me, that I should do what I want, had my mind set to do, to my own satisfaction. And so after that, I did not go back to Swarthmore because I became vulnerable to the draft, which became a search as to how I could get an education and not just learn how to fire a gun. And so the only one that would take me right away, because the draft was imminent and coming down my neck, was to join the Air Force. The Navy and Coast Guard had a backlog, and so I signed up to go into the Air Force.
And when you say draft, do you mean Korea?
No,
What year are we in now?
Korea.
Okay. Because Vietnam wouldn't have been till the 60s, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the psychologist told you to do what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
Did that give you a feeling of freedom?
Oh, yeah.
How long after that did you, was it before you went into the Air Force?
I think it was probably another year.
And what did you do between then and joining?
Well, it was kind of insequential stuff. Little jobs, working in a grocery store and all that.
Okay. So you joined the Air Force.
Yeah.
And had you gone back to D.C. from Pennsylvania at that time? Like before, I'm sorry, I asked that in a bad way. So in that year that you were waiting to go into the Air Force, did you move from Pennsylvania, where you had been at Swarthmore, did you move back to D.C., or were you already back in D.C.?
Oh, well, I was already back in D.C. when school was up for summer.
Okay. So when you started in the Air Force, where were you? Where did you do your basic training, or where did you go first?
Well, I went to Geneva, New York, and I forget the name of that air base up there. It was formerly a Navy air base. I did my basic training up in Geneva, New York.
Was it Belafonte?
What was?
Oh no, that was in Ohio, right? So you started in Geneva. What did you learn up there? What was your first sort of your like coming into the Air Force? Like, what were the first things they taught you?
Well, the first thing they taught us was discipline. And we had a what we call a TI, or tactical instructor, who was the guy that woofed at us all the time to keep us in line. For example, here we are, a line of raggedy civilians lined up, and he's walking back and forth, and he's saying, "Okay, we got you guys here all from all walks of life." He says, "You're a bunch of dummies, but I got some smart ones in here too. How many had college training?" And a college boy stepped out, right? He said, "Look at these other guys that are left behind and know that they're dummies and that you gotta teach them something." And they were feeling good. I wasn't one of them. They were feeling good because somebody told me don't volunteer for nothing. So uh, they told the college boys, now I want you to take a toothbrush and go into the bathroom or the latrine, and I want you to take this toothbrush and clean the floor and show these dummies how to do it.
And so that was the beginning.
That's the beginning.
So, were you with the same group all the way through your training there?
Well, I was, yeah. Normally they had a block assignment, and after I finished my training, then we were block assigned to go down to Biloxi, Mississippi, and they kind of screened us in terms of qualifications to go down there and go into certain disciplines that they needed in the Air Force. And of course, if your name was George Brown, look out, you're in trouble. There were about 50 George Browns, and misplacement was the rule. One of the guys I went to high school with was in that group. His name was George Brown. Now, he passed all the tests in terms of visual acuity, color, reading, and all of that, which were important in electronics. And they assigned him to the kitchen, and to be a cook. Ultimately, they found a mistake and moved him to hydraulics, but on the airplanes, but that took a while.
Mm-hmm. Was it was it an integrated space or was it segregated?
Oh no, base was always integrated.
Okay. Okay. So where were you assigned?
Well, I was assigned to electronics.
Okay.
Because that's what I applied for.
Okay.
And passed the test for.
Did you enjoy the work?
Oh, indeed. I went in enjoying, at that time, hi-fi, which was the rendering of music through a single speaker. My father had the hobby of hi-fi where they would build a cabinet around the woofer speakers that go boom, boom, boom. And they used to hang curtains and stuff like that into the cabinets to get a certain sound. And so I started in that hobby that he had, and thought I'd like to pursue electronics from there.
So how long was training?
I think it was like 16 weeks or something like that.
Okay.
When you say training, you're talking about basic training?
Yeah.
Basic training, yeah.
Okay. So you were originally in New York, and then you went down to Biloxi.
Yeah.
And after that, where did you go?
Well, I went from there to Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Okay. And was your training continued there?
No. I used to go back and forth to uh, Mississippi when some new equipment that I was not trained on came into being. I went there and to different places. Yeah.
And when did you exit the military?
50. Around 56.
Okay. Is there anything else about your time in the Air Force that you want to talk about?
Well, when I was assigned to Bellefontaine, Ohio, the Bellefontaine would kind of be an interim assignment for most airmen to come through there and continue with their development and then ship overseas. Well, I kind of became permanent party and never assigned overseas. And my name, I guess as I mustered out, I found out from the first sergeant who ran the place pretty much that I was doing all his work, so might as well send somebody else in my place. And so, I had applied in desperation at that time for Morocco, which was pitched at that time, and never got assigned. Somebody else's name was put up. So also I became such permanent party that I had a business downtown working as a TV repairman for the Good Housekeeping store.
Wow.
With another airman who worked on a different shift than mine, so we had total coverage. And of course, for that, we had to have permission of the base commander to do that. And so we confronted the base commander on what we wanted to do and wanted permission for. And he said, "Oh, by the way, I have this television that's been to the factory and they couldn't fix it. You think you want to give a try at it?" I said, "Sure." Gave us that TV, took back a new TV and gave it to him.
So, given that your parents were maybe not happy with your performance in college, how did they take you going into the military? And also, it sounds like you were very successful at what you did there.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I thought my father had connections that let me know I was going to be drafted, so it was okay that I signed up for that. They had no problem with me going into the military. But what also came into play was in a lot of step families, you have the tug of war between the mother and the stepmother and the ex-husband. All of that comes into play. Um, I remember, and I won't go. I'll go later to something else. But so there was a tug of war because when I got out of the military, I resided pretty much with my real mother, and that brought about some uh, friction.
How did that affect you?
Well, I thought that there's some stuff that was ingrained in me in my upbringing by my stepmother as to what's right and what's wrong. And so that kind of helped me continue to make good choices beyond the mistake I made uh, in the case of my real mother. But as I reflect, I have to weigh that matter of parents whose generally role is to provide shelter when the kids are growing up so they'll be free of pressures. And so to some extent, to respect what she was trying to do, perhaps later in the game, I'm referring to my mother, real mother, to try to play catch up.
Did she go on to marry after she divorced your father? Did she marry again?
Oh yeah, she married a military man.
Okay. Did they have kids?
No.
Okay. So.
He used to be from, I'm trying to remember, it was a suburb in New York where the rich folks lived, but he used to do landscaping during the summer. I used to work up there with him for a while.
So when you finished in the military, did you go to work right away?
Well, when I finished in the military, I needed a job. And so I found that the Weekend Warriors had summer camp. And so I joined the Air Force Reserve to go to summer camp so I'd get a paycheck. And so something in the name of Grenier Air Force Base comes to mind. They used to fly troop carrier planes, which had the biggest engine that the Air Force had, and it was 2 engines. And it did not glide too well, and one went out. And they had a regular route that they ran, and the pilot and co-pilot all kind of had worked for the airlines anyway in their day-to-day work. But on weekends, they flew these C-119s, which is cargo. They said travel tanks, cars, whatever, and troops. And so one weekend, instead of driving to summer camp, we all had to be troops to fly in the troop carrier wing. And they made me the head of the radars on an airplane. And so the task that I had, was to have my people pre-flight the radar before the plane was certified to travel. And so the regimen was to gas up in D.C. at Andrews Air Force Base, fly up to New Hampshire, and to come back on the same tank and gas up again in D.C. And somehow the regiment got screwed around, and we had taken off, and as we were over the Potomac, the engine began to sputter. And we had to turn around and land back at Andrews Air Force Base and get refueled. The command pilot was busted down to co-pilot, and so they had assigned a new command pilot. A lot of guys, once we landed, kind of in a bouncy way, quit right on the spot, would not enter plane again to resume the trip. So we lost a lot of personnel going up there.
But you stuck around.
I stuck around.
Yeah.
Needed the money.
And what else was it like before you? Were you still working other jobs at this? Because you said you were really just doing this in the summer, I guess?
Yeah, that was for the summer.
Okay. Did you have jobs the rest of the year?
Well, a guy who had a shoe shop wanted to expand it to a TV repair shop. And so he brought me on board to work there. And I also worked for another a repair shop in the 14th and U Street area, which was the black social area.
And when you say a black social area, what do you mean? Describe that.
Well, it's the center of black activity. U Street was the one where they had the nightclubs and movie theaters and the like. And this was kind of in the upper part of U Street, which was about, I guess 4 or 5 city block length.
Were you dating at this time? Were you social with the ladies?
I don't think so.
No?
Well, I probably was. I would go to the parties, yes.
But no one special at this time?
I was not professional.
No, I said no one special. Like you weren't in a
Oh, no,
like
no.
thing as a special.
No,
Okay.
no,
Okay.
no regular.
Um. So I have that your first job was with the Navy. We talked about that a little bit last time I was here, and that you started that job in 1959. So before we get on to that, is there anything else you want to talk about regarding this time when you were,
With Navy?
yeah, well, before you went to the Navy job?
Not anything that stands out.
Okay. How are you doing? Do you need to take a break or anything?
No, I'm fine.
You're good? Okay. Well then, how did you um, learn about the Navy job to apply for it?
Well, the Civil Service or HR Commission um, used to advertise vacancies. And I gather that I probably uh, used to get copies of their ads. I guess when I probably went to apply for a civil service job, and I went down to see announcements of what they were looking for, and I found that Navy civilians were being recruited, and that's how I came to take the Navy job.
Well, do you remember the job description or what it required?
I think it was electronic technician.
And what kind of work was that? What like practically day to day? What kind of work is that?
Well, it was not always the same kind of work. The Navy Yard at that time used to rehabilitate some of the ships that came in after being so many years at sea. Uh, and by the time those ships came in for rehab, then some of them needed to be rewired because of the damage that salt water had done with the wiring. And we used to make wiring harnesses to replace the bunch of wires that were on the internal part of the electronics in the ship. Some of them where they used to have old time fuse holders used to have pennies stuck in there just to keep the current going. Some of the wires would be burned out in disrepair, and we used to deal with that. So that was kind of work that they did. Now, we were also Navy and Marine Corps. Marine Corps was a part of the Navy. And so we worked at the Quantico, the Marine Corps Air Base, in their aviation equipment area. Usually when they would update equipment or install new equipment in the control tower or out on landing field, then they'd assign us down there to complete the job. Now, there was discrimination in terms of who was assigned to do what. Now, you had to run wires from X to Y. X being the equipment out on the field, to Y, to the control tower. Now, from X to Y, the black employees were assigned to work in the vermin uh, droppings and stuff, which were kind of in trenches under the airfield to pull wires and traverse all that mess to the control tower. Once the wires arrived at the control tower, then the white employees would show up with shirt and tie and connect the wires in the cabinets that they go to, the electronic cabinets that they go to. And so usually the supervisor, foreman, or what have you, over that crew of black technicians would make the assignments and give commands. When he got to the control tower, there was a windy day where we were working, and on the parapet or topmost part of the building on the corner, there was a pole on which there was an antenna. And the head of the crew, who was a white person, assigned me to go up the control tower and lean over on a leather belt to make the connection. Well, here's the wind blowing, and here's the pole swinging back and forth with me on it. And so I'm holding with one hand, and I could not reach the connection. And he's saying to me that I should lean back on that belt. And I said, look, I can't do that. And so I came down with the pole, and he wrote me up. I could have been fired on the spot. But at any rate, there's a veterans organization to which most of the veterans belonged in the Navy Yard, and they had the fire inspector go over the belt that I was to lean back on. The leather had cracks in it, and so that ended all that. Once he discovered it was not fit to use. And after that, rumors flew that I was a civil rights plant. And that's how they made me head of the crew on the presidential yacht, all of whom were black. And that's how I came to do that job, where the stewards periodically checked to see how much booze was still in the bottles.
So, I'm sorry, were you finished with your...
Yeah.
So, and by civil rights plant, what do you mean?
That I was placed in that in that position to challenge the practices of the office that may have had complaints or questions to gather material that could be used for an investigation.
Did they know what your father did? Did they know about his work?
No.
So what came of that officer that made you do that? I mean, did he know that the belt was in bad shape? Did he?
He didn't even give it regard. All he knew was a belt should be used.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the next job, which was on the boat for JFK.
Yeah.
Do I have the right Kennedy?
Yeah, JFK Airport.
Yeah, talk about that. Talk about that job.
Okay, in that job.
But wait, I'm sorry. So you're still with the Navy? You're still the electronics tech with the electronics mechanic with the Navy?
And I'm still applying to CAA, which was Civilian Air Force Authority, and it later became FAA, the Federal Aviation Agency,
Okay.
because the military had their own aviation operation with its own air traffic controllers. But we found that it had to be coordination so the two planes didn't run into each other. And the best thing was for the government or federal authority to take over the military air bases in terms of how they control traffic. Because the whole business of air traffic control was to separate planes so they wouldn't run into each other by height or by distance.
Okay. So, talk about the job on the. I keep saying boat. I think that's the wrong word. Boats are pretty small. Was it a ship? Was it considered a ship?
What was that?
The job for JFK.
A JFK.
Or.
Okay. I was a.
I think I'm asking.
Employee cooperation specialist.
Okay.
Now, I explained how I got into that. You recall that the government had not gotten into union bargaining until late in the game. The union, AFL-CIO, and all the others generally had unions, but the government had a non-strike kind of provision for its employees, and so they could not enjoy the ability to strike as other unions. And so there were people experienced in uh, uh, negotiating with unions, and a part of it was that employees came under a union contract that was agreed between the employees and the employer in the civilian area. And of course, the government became such that because of some unrest on the part of government employees, that they Congress decided to authorize, which becomes political too, the government to recognize unions. And so the government did not have the expertise in terms of negotiating union contracts. And so the government's only recourse was to hire some of these retired negotiators from private sector to come in and help set up the program and to negotiate contracts all around. Well, I was working in an area of human relations that dealt with the federal personnel laws and regulations in government. The person who was hired to head up the union negotiation branch was a retired Pan Am negotiator. And so when he came to D.C. to negotiate contract for our area, which was Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia, I was assigned from the federal side of HR or personnel, whichever you call it, to assist him and to help him write the contract of agreement with the employees. And so we had worked for a while, and I used to, when we were negotiating, I used to wear my Brooks Brothers three-piece suit that my cousin sold me that I had to lose weight to fit into. But anyhow, during negotiations, some of the guys that we were negotiating with said, "Are you a lawyer?" But that's one of the little anecdotes. But anyhow, when he was to return to New York, after I'd assisted him and we had negotiated the articles of the agreement, we were having a drink that Friday, and he said, "Herb, I like your style." He said, "How'd you like to work in New York?" I said, "Hey, yeah, it sounds good to me." He said, "Well, how soon could you get there?" I said, "A Friday, right?" And I said, "Is Monday soon enough?" And using my family and their connections, their college classmates who had kind of spread out around the country after graduation, they were able to connect me with some old classmates that they had and put me up until I got situated. So it tended to work out pretty well.
Yeah. Well, so you were, and during the bargaining process, you were clearly bargaining on the side of
The government.
the government.
Yeah.
Do you happen to remember the name of the union? Was it the NFE, maybe the National Federation of Federal Employees? Because I think they represent a lot of federal civilian workers now. Do you happen to remember?
Well, we did not have, no, we didn't deal with them.
Okay.
The air traffic controllers, for example, set up their own union.
Mm-hmm. PATCO.
Yeah, President Air Traffic Control,
Mm-hmm.
professional air traffic control.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now we had technicians, electronic technicians, and we had air traffic controllers, two disciplines that cooperated together in the whole business of controlling air traffic.
So it sounds like you really enjoyed the process of bargaining. Do you remember what they were asking for? Do you remember any of the things that made it into that first contract?
I would say nothing. There were certain benefits and whatnot that were guaranteed that came with their employment that they were not aware of, which we put in the contract more as an information vehicle than as some give and take in terms of what they accepted and what they did not accept. So it was more setting up the program.
Okay, I see. So when you were asked to move to New York,
Yeah.
to work with that lawyer that had come down to help with the bargaining, at that time, did you have a family?
Yes.
And did you move the whole family up to New York?
Well, it wasn't a family. I had a wife.
Okay.
That was it.
Okay. And she went up with you. Was it a big...
Well, she worked for the Department of Defense, and she was able to ultimately get transferred up to their installations up in Long Island.
Okay. So what kind of work did you do up there?
Well, I did that, plus I had some other collateral assignments from the direct head of the personnel HR department up in New York, which was the eastern coast of the nation.
Okay.
One of which had to do with sensitivity training. Was one of my assignments. It seemed that the head of FAA had given accolades to, I believe, the mid section of the country's organization or the West Coast, I'm not sure which, to do sensitivity training. And I was assigned to do, since there was so much accolades for that, the personnel director said to me, Herb, get me some. And so I had to set up sensitivity training.
And what did that? I'm sorry, I interrupted. Um, so if you uh, want to finish that thought and then answer the question, what does sensitivity training mean at that time?
And sensitivity mean at that time someone was referred to touchy-feely, but it's the point where it's team building amongst managers, but a looking in at one's self and style in terms of managing. And they broke off into groups as to how others see you and how you see yourself. And it's kind of an intensive kind of situation. I guess I was the only black person in that whole enterprise conducting the thing with the assistance of a training specialist. Now that was conducted about a week-long enterprise in a remote area where we did not have radios or TV or anything.
Okay, so like a retreat.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so what did the training look like? What were the different topics covered?
Well, the topic kind of covered paternalistic kind of training, management, into other kinds of management. And when I say paternalistic management, I'll give you an example. One of the long-term elderly managers had some younger women who had a lifestyle on weekends to fly about the country with their pilot boyfriends. No children, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you had some other managers that had 4 or 5 kids. And when promotion time came, that manager that was in our workshop would promote the one that had family responsibilities rather than these young ladies who really were extremely productive. And as we dug into his style, he was also friend and deeply rooted with the archdiocese of the city he was in, and so he had real roots in that situation, and so I think some of the managers felt it was so intense and critical of their style. Some of them felt as they were going to retirement rather than do all this current style of management that was being practiced.
Did you enjoy having a more, I guess, administrative role, like managing different projects and putting the content together?
Well, it's more a matter of I did what I had to do, and I guess set my mind to enjoy whatever
Okay.
I had to do.
Okay. How you feeling?
I'm feeling fine.
You feeling fine? We can go. We've been talking for an hour and 40 minutes. Can you believe it?
Isn't it? It's time run.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's do a little more. But maybe stop around 2 hours, just so we don't wear ourselves out today. Okay.
All right.
I feel like you could probably go all day. Maybe I'm the one who needs the break. Uh, um, so you're still with the FAA, is that right?
When?
Well, so
in that sensitivity training?
yeah.
Yeah.
I guess the Civilian Air Force Authority, which is now the FAA. And it looks like you were there in that role until 1965. Were you in New York that whole time?
I was in New York only about a couple of years.
Okay. And then after that, did you come back to DC?
Yeah.
And my notes say that in 1965, there was a newly created position called the Manpower and Training Officer.
That was that was quasi a personnel, HR, and technical. In that case, my position there was to assign training to technicians on new equipment and shipping them off to school to get updated on various equipment they would have to work on and get informed and whatnot. The other, I guess, had to do with handling employee relations in terms of whether they're getting ready for retirement and what their benefits would be and that kind of thing, to coordinate that information with them.
Okay. And so it was the newly created, I guess, was it a department or?
Well, it was created, I guess we had area offices at that time. Our area was Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia.
And were you asked to head that up, or was it open and you applied, or?
Well, it was a reorganization. I was on a assignment, obviously, up in Long Island. It was a matter that with that reorganization, then they had surplus employees. And what had happened was that the staff up in Long Island was going to have to lose one employee. And the New York people were so engaged in New York, even to the extent that their whole family had been in rent-controlled apartments where they did not have to pay the going rate, but were subsidized by the New York government. And so that was the family institution. They did not want to have to settle in D.C. and pay a going rate rent or try to buy a house or whatever. So I agreed. I said, look, if that's all your problem is, I'll go back to D.C. I don't have that much love, 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 love of New York to stay up there.
Okay. So, and you moved back with your wife?
Yep.
And were you glad to be near your family again, your parents?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And were you at the time sort of involved in any outside organizations like volunteering or things like that? Were you doing any of that kind of work?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. So what was the move back to DC like?
Well, I think that my wife and her sister, they're both twins, jointly owned a house together. And we returned and settled back in the house. And then I moved on out to Maryland.
Do you know what, was that a house in DC?
Yeah.
What part of DC?
Northwest.
Okay. And this was Lydia?
Yeah, that was my first wife, yeah.
And had your daughter been born by the time, she had been born by the time you moved back?
Well, she was she was born when we had moved to a house in Maryland.
Okay.
But we did commute to D.C. When she was born to the hospital. A snowy day, and we got in the car and drove to D.C. for her delivery.
And tell me about being a father for the first time.
About my who?
No, about you being a father for the first time.
Well, it was a new experience. All I can say is that I believe my wife had a friend or relative that came to help her with the baby for a time. And I pretty well was a breadwinner.
Okay. Did your wife, Lydia, did she ever work outside the home?
Well, she had a government job.
Okay. Was she able to go back to that at some point?
Well, she didn't want to.
Okay, so after that point, she was just a mom and a housewife. Okay, not just a. That's very important work. I don't mean to sound demeaning, but okay. So, at what point? So I have a title for you here. Maybe we jumped ahead a little. The Employee Management Cooperation Specialist, that was the role that got you to New York, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you came back to DC, that was the Manpower and Training Officer? Or was that the employee relations specialist?
That was the employee relations specialist.
And how was that? Can you describe that work?
Well, that was the benefits position where I was responsible for counseling employees. It had nothing to do with the technical.
Mm-hmm.
It was counseling the employees in terms of benefits and so forth. Because they had to select health benefits under government that they wanted and so forth and so on.
So like health insurance, life
Yeah, all
insurance,
that.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, did you like that? Did you enjoy that work?
Yeah, I guess pretty much. A lot of the jobs I had was in every other thing assigned. So you're not locked into a straitjacket.
Okay. How many people do you think you worked with? I mean, how big was,
How many people did I work for?
not work for, but in terms of all of the employees there that would come to you about with benefits to talk about benefits? How many people worked there that you were helping?
Oh, um, maybe about 50
Oh,
people.
was there any, because it sounds like you were sort of counseling people on their benefits a lot. Did that fill your 40 hours every week, or were there other jobs that you had to do in that role, or other work you had to do in that role?
Yeah, but I can't particularly point to specifics.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, for example, there were jobs like summer employment of kids that they had a program in GC for. For example, under the mayor at the time had a summer jobs program for the kids who were out of school during the summer, and they would have little government jobs where they would be assigned to certain government offices to run errands and take the duplicating papers to the duplicator and all that in the building.
Okay. It looks like next up is personnel officer, but I'm going to recommend that we stop here for the day and pick that up on our next part of the interview. How about that?
Okay, fine.